A single man's journey once crashed the price of gold across an entire continent without firing a single arrow. He didn't conquer it with armies. He walked into it with camels, slaves, and enough gold to blind an empire. This is the story of the kingdom the world forgot and the king who made the world remember. Before you judge this story, ask yourself, could you guess this empire's name right now? Stay until the end because the answer changes everything you think you know about wealth, power, and history. And if forgotten empires fascinate you, subscribe now because this gold is about to run out. In the 13th century, the world outside West Africa knew almost nothing about what lay beyond the Sahara Desert. To European and Middle Eastern eyes, the desert was the edge of the map, a wasteland separating the known world from myth. Mapmakers filled the blank spaces beyond it with monsters, legends, and guesses. But beneath that myth was a functioning economic engine, one that had been running for centuries, largely invisible to the powers of the Mediterranean. Salt moved south from mining towns deep in the Sahara, where it was cut into slabs and carried by caravan for weeks across open desert. In some regions, salt was so scarce and so valuable that it was reportedly traded pound for pound with gold, a commodity essential for preserving food and sustaining life, treated with the same reverence as precious metal. Gold moved north in the opposite direction, dug from riverbeds and shallow pits in the forested regions south of the savannah, then funneled into trade networks that stretched thousands of miles. And somewhere in between, camel caravans crossed the harshest terrain on Earth, carrying wealth that would eventually make its way into the coinage of Europe and the treasuries of the Islamic world. This was the Trans-Saharan Trade Network, one of the most important and least understood economic systems in human history. It connected sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa, the Middle East, and by extension, Europe, centuries before any European ship ever reached the West African coast. Gold mined in the forest near the Gulf of Guinea passed through dozens of hands before it was minted into coins used in Venice, Cairo, or Baghdad, and at nearly every stage of that journey, one power decided who profited and who didn't. And at the center of that network, controlling the flow of gold like a valve on a pipeline, sat an empire most people today have never heard of, the Mali Empire. Mali's story does not begin with gold. It begins with war. Before Mali rose, the region had already seen one great trading power, the earlier Ghana Empire, sometimes called Ouagadougou by its own people, which for centuries controlled portions of the same gold and salt routes. Arab geographers writing as early as the 8th century described Ghana as a kingdom of extraordinary wealth, its rulers said to possess gold in quantities that seemed almost impossible to outsiders. But by the 12th century, Ghana's power had weakened, worn down by drought, overextension, and the gradual fragmentation of the trade networks it once controlled. Out of that vacuum, new powers began competing for control of the same gold-bearing lands, and one man in particular came to dominate the region through fear. In the early 13th century, the region was dominated by a ruler named Sumanguru Kante, king of the Soso people. Remembered in oral tradition as ruthless and feared, said to practice sorcery to hold power over his rivals, and to have destroyed or subjugated the surrounding Mandinka chiefdoms to secure his dominance. Among those who suffered under his expansion was a small Mandinka kingdom whose royal family became entangled in his campaigns of conquest. Within that royal family was a young prince named Sundiata Keita, heir to the throne, who according to oral tradition was unable to walk for much of his early childhood and was mocked, marginalized, and eventually exiled alongside his mother following the death of his father and the seizure of power by rivals. For years, Sundiata lived as an outsider, moving from court to court among neighboring kingdoms, watched with suspicion by hosts who feared the political consequences of sheltering him, yet gradually building the relationships, alliances, and reputation that would define his eventual return. According to the epic oral tradition preserved by griots, West Africa's hereditary historians and oral custodians, Sundiata eventually regained his strength, both physical and political. He formed alliances with several other exiled Mandinka princes who had also suffered under Sumanguru's expansion and slowly assembled a coalition capable of directly challenging the Soso king's dominance over the region. What followed was not a single skirmish, but a sustained campaign, years of maneuvering, shifting alliances, and smaller confrontations that gradually shifted the balance of power away from Sumanguru. Around 1235, that campaign reached its climax at the Battle of Girina, fought on the plains near the Niger River. Oral accounts describe a clash between two very different visions of power, Sumanguru's rule through fear and Sundiata's coalition built on alliance and shared grievance. The battle ended in decisive defeat for Sumanguru, breaking the dominance of the Soso kingdom over the region and clearing the path to a new political order. Griots have preserved this battle for nearly 800 years as the founding myth of the Mali Empire, a story of exile, endurance, and conquest that is still recited today in Mali, Guinea, and across the broader Mandinka cultural world. Following his victory, Sundiata was declared Mansa, a title meaning emperor or king of kings, by an assembly of allied chiefs, an event oral tradition frames as the founding moment of a new political order known as the Kurukanfuga, a set of governing principles set to have organized the rules of clans, the division of resources, and the rules of the new empire. From this foundation, Sundiata began consolidating the surrounding territories into a unified state, absorbing smaller kingdoms and chiefdoms, and, crucially, extending control over the gold fields of Bambouk and Bure, regions whose exact locations were kept deliberately obscure from outsiders for generations, protected as closely as any military secret. This is where Mali's real power began, not on the battlefield alone, but in what came after it, control of gold. Here is what made Mali's gold economy so unusual and so effective. The empire did not mine the gold directly. The gold-bearing regions to the south were largely populated by peoples outside Mali's direct political control, and the empire's rulers appear to have understood that attempting to conquer and administer the mining regions themselves would be less profitable and far riskier than controlling the routes and markets through which that gold had to pass on its way north. Historical accounts, recorded primarily by Arab travelers and geographers such as al-Bakri and later al-Umari, describe a system sometimes called the silent trade, in which gold miners from the southern forest regions would bring their gold to designated trading points, lay it out, and then withdraw out of sight. Malian traders would then arrive, lay out an equivalent value of salt or goods beside the gold, and withdraw in turn. The miners would return, and if satisfied with the exchange, take the goods and leave the gold behind. If not, they would leave both piles untouched until an agreeable balance was reached. Whether this practice was carried out exactly as chroniclers described, or whether it was partly mythologized by outside observers unfamiliar with the region's actual trading customs, the underlying reality it points to is well documented. The empire protected the exact source of its gold so fiercely that even its closest trading partners in North Africa and the Middle East, who depended on that gold for their own economies, never learned precisely where it came from. This secrecy was in itself a form of economic power, arguably as valuable to the empire as the gold itself. As demand for gold grew across the Islamic world and indirectly into Europe through Mediterranean trade, Mali sat as the essential and unavoidable middleman. Merchants could not bypass the empire to reach the source because they didn't know where the source was. They could only trade through Mali, on Mali's terms, at Mali's markets. Cities like Timbuktu, Dene, and Gao rose along these trade corridors, transforming from small riverside settlements into major centers of commerce, scholarship, and Islamic learning. Camel caravans stretching for miles moved gold north and salt south, while merchants from Cairo, Fez, Tripoli, and beyond funneled their goods into Mali's markets, always paying Mali's price. Taxes were levied on both imports and exports passing through the empire's territory, and the state's control over key river crossings along the Niger and desert routes across the Sahara meant few traders could bypass its authority even if they wanted to. Salt, copper, cloth, and horses flowed in. Gold, ivory, and enslaved people flowed out, in a system that generated enormous and sustained wealth for the ruling Keita dynasty. By the time Mansa Musa rose to the throne around 1312, the empire he inherited was already the wealthiest state in West Africa, stretching across territories that today include parts of modern Mali, Senegal, Guinea, Mauritania, and Niger. It was, by most estimates, one of the largest empires in the world at that time by territory. But Musa would do something no ruler before him had done. He would make the entire world witness that wealth firsthand. Mansa Musa's path to the throne is itself debated by historians. Arab chronicler al-Umari, writing decades later based on accounts gathered in Cairo, recorded a story in which Musa's predecessor, Mansa Abu Bakr, became obsessed with the idea of the Atlantic Ocean's edge and launched an expedition of hundreds of ships to explore it, from which none returned, after which Musa, then serving as deputy, assumed full rule of the empire. Modern historians treat this account with caution, as it survives through second-hand retellings rather than direct Malian sources. What is certain, regardless of how he came to power, is that Musa understood something his predecessors had not fully grasped. Gold was not just wealth, it was leverage, and leverage meant nothing if the world didn't know you had it. In 1324, Musa set out on the Hajj, the Islamic pilgrimage to Mecca, which every able Muslim is obligated to undertake at least once in their lifetime. For Musa, a devout ruler, it was a religious duty, but whether by design or by consequence, it became the greatest display of economic power the medieval world had ever witnessed. Historical accounts describe an almost unimaginable procession. Chroniclers wrote of a caravan numbering in the tens of thousands, soldiers to protect the retinue, officials to manage its logistics, scholars and religious advisors, servants and enslaved attendants dressed in fine silk, all moving together across thousands of miles of desert and savanna. Camels numbering in the thousands carried supplies, provisions, and, above all, gold in both dust and bar form, intended to fund the journey and to be distributed as religious charity along the way. Estimates of the total amount of gold carried vary enormously among historians, and precise figures from the period should be treated with caution. But the consistency of the awe expressed by contemporary observers across multiple independent accounts suggests the scale was extraordinary even by the standards of any medieval royal procession. As Musa's procession moved through Cairo, then one of the great cities of the Islamic world and the critical hub of Mediterranean trade, he gave away gold freely, to the poor he encountered in the streets, to religious scholars, to local officials, to anyone's path crossed his. Contemporary accounts describe him purchasing goods at inflated prices without negotiation and distributing gifts with a generosity that stunned local observers accustomed to more calculated displays of royal wealth. By all indications, this was an act of genuine religious devotion and a desire to be remembered as a just and pious ruler, not a calculated economic strategy. But the economic consequence was severe and almost certainly unintended. So much gold flooded into Cairo's markets over the weeks of Musa's stay that its value collapsed relative to other goods and currencies. Historical and economic analyses drawing on the accounts of Cairo-based chroniclers suggest gold prices in Egypt took over a decade to fully recover from the shock of Musa's spending. Some accounts even note that Musa, having depleted so much of his supply by the time of his return journey through Cairo, was forced to borrow gold back from local merchants at high interest rates simply to fund his caravan's journey home. A striking reversal for a ruler who had, only weeks earlier, been handing gold out by the fistful. A single man moving through a single city on what was fundamentally a religious errand had unintentionally triggered what modern economists might recognize as an inflationary shock, centuries before anyone had a framework to describe it in those terms. This was not warfare in the traditional sense. No armies clashed in the streets of Cairo, no walls were breached, no soldiers died. But in economic terms, it functioned like a kind of conquest. An empire from beyond a desert most Mediterranean powers considered impassable had reshaped the financial reality of one of the wealthiest cities in the medieval world simply by passing through it on the way to Mecca and back. News of Musa's wealth spread rapidly, carried by merchants, pilgrims, and scholars across the trade networks of the Mediterranean and into Europe. Word of an African king whose gold seemed limitless became a recurring subject of fascination in Arab and, eventually, European accounts. By 1375, cartographers working in Spain, likely Majorcan Jewish cartographer Abraham Cresques and his workshop, produced the Catalan Atlas, one of the most celebrated and detailed maps of the medieval period, depicting Mansa Musa seated on a golden throne in the region of West Africa, crowned, holding a golden orb in one hand and a scepter in the other, with an inscription describing him as the richest and most noble king of all the land. It marked, as far as historians can determine, the first time a sub-Saharan African ruler had been rendered with such prominence and specificity in European cartography. Mali had gone, within a single generation, from a kingdom Europe didn't know existed to one European mapmakers considered worth depicting in gold leaf. Back home, Musa used this newfound wealth and international recognition to transform his empire, both physically and intellectually. On his return journey from Mecca, he reportedly brought back architects and scholars, most notably an Andalusian architect and poet known as Abu Ishaq al-Sahili, who's traditionally credited with helping design new mosques and public buildings using building techniques not previously common in the region, including the use of fired brick in place of purely mud construction. Among the most significant results was the Djinguedabe Mosque in Timbuktu, a structure that, though modified and rebuilt over the centuries, still stands today as one of the most recognizable monuments of the empire's golden age. Musa commissioned the construction of additional mosques and centers of learning across his territory, including expanded support for what would become Sankore, a center of scholarship in Timbuktu that, under his patronage and that of his successors, drew students, teachers, and religious scholars from across the Islamic world. Manuscripts on law, astronomy, medicine, theology, and mathematics were collected, copied, and studied there over the following centuries, some of which survive today in private and institutional collections in Timbuktu and beyond, offering rare and invaluable documentary evidence of a thriving intellectual culture in medieval West Africa, a fact still significantly underrepresented in mainstream historical narratives about the medieval world. It was not only Musa's own accounts that documented this golden age. Roughly 2 decades after Musa's pilgrimage, the celebrated Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta visited the Mali Empire directly during the reign of Musa's successor, Mansa Suleiman. Ibn Battuta's detailed travel account offers one of the only surviving first-hand descriptions of the empire from an outside observer, who actually set foot within it rather than relying on second-hand reports filtered through Cairo. He described an empire with a functioning and highly structured court, elaborate ceremonial protocols, and, notably, a strong emphasis on justice and public order, recording that travelers could cross the empire's territory without fear of robbery or violence, a level of security he considered remarkable compared to other regions he had visited. He also candidly described Mansa Suleiman as notably less extravagantly generous than the stories of Musa had led him to expect, suggesting that Musa's legendary open-handedness may have been an exception rather than the norm even within his own dynasty. At its territorial and economic peak, roughly spanning the reigns of Musa and Suleiman in the first half of the 14th century, Mali stretched across a vast portion of West Africa, incorporating dozens of vassal states and tributary regions, controlling major trade routes running both east-west and north-south, taxing merchants at multiple points along those routes, and commanding a level of wealth so significant that some modern historians and economists have described Musa as possibly the richest individual in recorded human history, with some popular estimates placing his wealth in terms that would translate to hundreds of billions of dollars in modern currency. It's worth noting that such figures are, by necessity, rough and speculative extrapolations, given the limitations of medieval record-keeping and the difficulty of converting gold reserves and land control into modern monetary equivalents. What is not disputed, however, is the scale of the impact. An empire built on controlled scarcity, guarded secrecy, and, in Musa's case, extraordinary and consequential generosity, had become a dominant and internationally recognized force in the medieval global economy. The empire also maintained a military structure capable of protecting this wealth and enforcing control over its vast territory. Accounts describe a standing force that could be called upon to defend trade routes, put down regional uprisings, and project authority over distant vassal states, supplemented by cavalry forces that gave the empire mobility across the open savanna terrain that made up much of its territory. This military capacity was not primarily used for outward conquest during Mali's peak years, but rather for maintaining internal cohesion across an empire that spanned an enormous and ethnically diverse territory, held together as much by trade dependency and shared economic interest as by direct military occupation. But empires built so heavily around the influence and vision of a single extraordinary leader carry a structural weakness that history has repeated many times: succession. After Mansa Musa's death around 1337, the empire began a slow but steady decline. His son and successor, Magan, reigned only briefly before his own death, and the throne passed to Musa's brother Suleiman, whose reign, the one documented by Ibn Battuta, maintained much of the empire's stability but lacked the singular international impact of his predecessor's pilgrimage. In the decades that followed Suleiman's death, succession disputes became more frequent and more damaging as rival branches of the royal family competed for the throne, diverting resources, attention, and loyalty away from the systems of trade and taxation that had sustained the empire's wealth. Regional governors and vassal states, once tightly bound to the central authority in the imperial capital, began asserting greater independence, withholding taxes owed to the crown, and in some cases, forming their own alliances with rival powers outside Mali's traditional sphere of influence. Historical accounts describe growing instability across the 14th and 15th centuries, with internal power struggles gradually eroding the cohesion that had once allowed Mali to project both military authority and economic dominance across such an enormous territory. Some accounts also point to environmental pressures, including shifts in rainfall patterns affecting agricultural regions within the empire, as a contributing factor, placing additional strain on an already weakening central government. At the same time, external pressures mounted from multiple directions. To the north and west, Tuareg groups based in the Sahara began raiding weakened border regions and, in the 15th century, seized control of Timbuktu itself for a period, disrupting the city's trade and administration even before its eventual absorption by a rising rival power. That rising power was the Songhai Empire, based along the Niger River to the east, which had once existed as a vassal state under Mali's authority, paying tribute and supplying soldiers to the Keita dynasty during its peak. Under ambitious and militarily capable leaders, most notably Sunni Ali in the second half of the 15th century, Songhai broke decisively away from Mali's control and began an aggressive campaign of territorial expansion, absorbing former Malian territories and, crucially, the trade routes that had once funneled gold and salt exclusively through Mali's markets. Songhai forces captured Timbuktu in 1468, taking control of a city that had once stood as the crown jewel of Mali's intellectual and economic network. With Timbuktu's fall, control over key sections of the trans-Saharan gold trade shifted decisively away from the Keita dynasty and toward a new imperial power that would go on to dominate the region for the following century, until its own eventual collapse following a Moroccan invasion in 1591, a separate and later chapter in West Africa's long history of gold, trade, and empire. Mali did not collapse in a single dramatic battle, the way empires sometimes do in more dramatized retellings of history. Its decline was gradual and uneven, a slow erosion of territory, trade dominance, and political unity, stretched across more than a century, as rival powers absorbed what remained of its influence piece by piece, and neighboring Mossi kingdoms to the south and Tuareg forces to the north raided its increasingly porous borders. By the 16th century, the empire that had once made Cairo's economy tremble and that European cartographers had once depicted holding a golden orb had been reduced to a fraction of its former territory.
Its gold routes had been redirected through new powers and new intermediaries, and its name gradually faded from the trade ledgers of merchants who had once depended on it entirely for their livelihoods. And yet, despite the extraordinary scale of what Mali achieved, despite Mansa Musa's pilgrimage remaining, by most historical assessments, one of the most extraordinary and economically consequential displays of individual wealth ever recorded, the empire's story faded from mainstream historical memory for centuries, both within global historical scholarship and in popular awareness. Part of this stems from the practical limitations of written record-keeping in the region during that era. Much of Mali's own internal history was preserved through oral tradition, passed down by griots across generations, rather than through the kind of extensive written archives and administrative documentation that shaped and preserved European historical narratives of the same period. Oral tradition is not inherently less reliable than written record, but it has historically been treated with more skepticism by Western academic institutions, contributing to Mali's marginalization in global historical narratives for generations. Part of the reason also stems from centuries of historical scholarship, particularly during and after the era of European colonization of Africa, that simply overlooked, minimized, or dismissed African history prior to European contact, treating regions like Mali as peripheral footnotes to a broader story centered on Europe and the Mediterranean world, rather than recognizing them as major and influential powers in their own right, actively shaping global trade and economics on their own terms. It has only been in recent decades, through the work of historians, archaeologists, economists, and researchers working both within and outside West Africa, that scholarship has worked seriously to reconstruct and properly credit Mali's role in shaping the medieval global economy. This ongoing work recognizes Mansa Musa not as a curious footnote or a piece of internet trivia about historical wealth, but as one of history's most consequential economic figures, a ruler whose single religious pilgrimage altered the financial trajectory of an entire region for over a decade, and whose empire's careful, deliberate control over one of the ancient world's most valuable resources shaped trade patterns across 3 continents for generations. The gold mines of Bambouk and Beret are no longer secret, mapped today by modern geologists rather than protected by silent traders working in the shadows. The trade routes across the Sahara have long since given way to different economies, different powers, different maps, and different technologies of exchange.
But the story of Mali, of Sundiata's rise from exile and childhood hardship to founding one of history's great empires, of a gold-based economy built on discipline and secrecy rather than brute force extraction, of Musa's calculated devotion that became unintentional economic upheaval on the streets of Cairo, and of Sankara's scholars preserving centuries of knowledge in a city built on gold and salt, remains one of history's most remarkable and most overlooked chapters. So here's the question worth sitting with. If you controlled that kind of wealth, enough to reshape the economy of a major city just by walking through it on your way somewhere else, what would you do with it? Would you spend it to build, to educate, to be remembered for generosity, the way Musa apparently chose to? Or would you, like so many empires before and after Mali, eventually lose control of the very system that made you powerful in the first place, watching it pass into the hands of the next rising power? Leave your answer in the comments below. And if this story of a forgotten empire changed how you see history, subscribe now, because there's another lost kingdom waiting, another ruler the world forgot, and another empire whose gold has already run out, waiting only for someone to tell its story.